tremendous dietary ordeal. Ultra-processed food, it's been designed to be addictive, and it's been very successful. Sadness and negativity and the absence of joy.
Wanting chocolate or doughy food. These are signs that you might need a particular amino acid.
Where have these amino acids been? Why don't more people know about them?
There's an amino acid that triggers the release of GLP-1. So you can tell us what amino acid, and does it work on other brain areas as well?
The neurotransmitters can affect our appetite and our moods.
What really resonated with me was this true versus false mood. So can you talk about this distinction? I think it's so important for people who are like, I have everything and yet I don't feel good.
Produce pain-relieving wonders by raising endorphins.
For
We're
me,
talking about chronic physical pain.
chronic physical pain.
Right.
Yeah,
So I've mentioned that too, but
Yeah.
we don't get nearly the number of people with chronic physical pain as we do people with chronic emotional pain. So
Yeah.
it's important for me that you and I make it clear that emotional pain is a common reality now.
It is a common reality, and it's so sad. That's why I thought, like, this message is so incredibly important. This gave me such hope, and that I just want to share with people. If you struggle with mood issues, feel down often, need a little focus, hit a hard patch in your life and don't know what to do, or struggle with chronic pain, I want you to stick with me because I'm here with a legend. Her name is Julia Ross. She's been using amino acids. She's actually a world leader in the nutritional use of amino acids for mood problems, eating disorders, and addictions. She's been doing this work we just talked about for over 40 years. She has taught me so much, and her suggestions and working with her has literally transformed my life at some very key moments. And so, Julia, I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, thank you for all of the work you're doing. It is truly an honor, and I just can't wait to share all of your wisdom with this audience.
Thank you, Autumn. I'm so glad to be here again. It's been a long time.
It's been a long time, and I was going to do my dissertation on your work, and then life took me in another direction, but I'm so glad that we've been able to come back together, because I just think your work is so needed, so necessary, so impactful. So why don't you start there? What do you think is the most inspiring or surprising story of transformation you've seen in your 40 years of using these amino acids?
Well, since there have been thousands of thrilling stories, I had to do a lot of thinking. You know, you told me you'd like to start out this way, and I just like to tell the story of how I discovered these wonders that have led to so much healing over the years. Looking for an internship during my graduate program in clinical psychology, I had run out of my student loan. I had to have an internship that paid. There was only one internship in San Francisco that paid, and it was an addiction treatment program, long-term residential program for alcoholic men. Now, at the time, I couldn't think of anything more depressing. And I had lots of other things that were so exciting. The whole world of clinical psychology was exploding with techniques. I was particularly gifted with dream interpretation and art therapy, and I was psychodrama. I was exploring all kinds of things. But I joined the staff as an intern and in the late 70s. And for a while, introducing all these exciting psychological techniques, we were on top of the world. We were doing so well. Our clients loved their work with us, the psychological work. They had 3 meals a day at the residence. They were all either working or in some sort of day treatment or school. And that lasted for about 4 years. And then suddenly, we couldn't help anyone any longer. Residents who came in disappeared within 48 hours. We'd never seen that before with the primarily alcoholic clients that we had. What we were seeing was an epidemic of crack cocaine addiction. And the whole country, by then, the addiction treatment industry was very vigorous throughout the country. And every program in the country was reporting the same thing. Many of us in the field were seriously thinking about changing careers. And I was one of them. And then we were introduced to neuroscience. This was a new field, and the research had been going on since the 70s. We're now in the mid-80s, early 80s, and they're ready to report. And a group of them who specifically focused on the brain and addiction came to town in a conference for addiction professionals and gave us the answer. Now, most people in the field did not follow their lead, but there were a number of us throughout the country who did, and all of us had the same experience. So I'm going to tell you about our first client who was benefited by the information that the neuroscientists shared about which nutrients fed which parts of the brain, affecting which kinds of feelings and behaviors. In this case, we're talking about African-American postal worker in his late 30s with a very supportive wife and parents. All of them were involved in our outpatient program, in the family, in the education, in the counseling, and he was still using crack on a regular basis. He was about 5 inches from being fired at his job. And they were all desperate. They knew that this was the end of the line. If we couldn't help, then there wasn't any. They'd tried so many things. What happened was that we gave him one amino acid, which feeds the part of the brain that cocaine targets. The part of the brain, we'll talk about it later, that produces energy and vitality and focus. And we sent him home. He came back a week later to a report. It was the first week in 5 years that he had not used crack.
Wow. That's insane. Did he keep his job? Did he keep his family? He just went on. Did he continue the therapy?
Yes.
Oh.
They trusted us. Whatever we wanted, they were going to do. There was a wonderful family that way. So he was about to be fired because they were waiting to give him one more urine test. And, by the time we'd finished seeing him, they'd given him probably 10. And they were all clean.
Oh, Julia, that's amazing. And we're going to talk about it because addiction, eating disorders, food addiction, wanting chocolate or doughy foods or the combination of cheese and bread. I mean, these are all maybe needing aerobic exercise, sometimes to excess. These are signs that you might need a particular amino acid called DLPA that we're going to go into. But as I told you, we got to give people a little rapid fire moment so that they can see your work goes beyond this particular amino acid. And I want
far beyond.
Far beyond it. I've just had an experience recently where I thought we need to dedicate an entire podcast to this particular amino acid. I want to break down all the other ones too. But first I want to give people a taste of what is possible with your nutritional amino acid therapy. So first, you've talked about there's an amino acid that triggers the release of GLP-1. So you can tell us what amino acid is that, and does it work on other brain areas as well?
Well, before we go into that, let's just give them an overview. I've just talked about one of them, which is energizing, but it turns out that there are 3 others. The star of the show at the moment, as you say, is the amino acid that the formation and release of GLP-1.
Oh, yes.
And that amino acid is glutamine, which may have the most widespread benefits of all of the amino acids, but they're all absolutely, literally, 20-pointed stars. So we've got the stimulating amino acid that I talked about earlier. That's tyrosine. And that one targets the part of the brain, the catecholamines, dopamine, norepinephrine, and adrenaline that give us that energy and push and vitality.
Focus.
Then we have the amino acid GABA, which is also gamma aminobutyric acid, which is also a neurotransmitter GABA that calms us down. That wipes out adrenaline so that we can relax. And in that regard, it helps with focus and concentration, along with the tyrosine that I mentioned earlier, that's energizing and concentrating. Finally, and your favorite at the moment, is the amino acid that increases our production and experience of the endorphins, our natural painkillers. But they don't just kill pain. They're famous for that, but they provide joy. When we talk about loving something, you were talking about chocolate and bread and a number of other lovable things. That kind of love is the expression of endorphin activity.
Yes, I felt it. And I felt it in like within an hour. It changed my state of being dramatically. So I'm excited to dive in.
So the amino acid most critical for this is called D-phenylalanine. And for many people, it's ideal when combined with another amino acid that also supports endorphin activity called L-phenylalanine.
And you can tell us, I mean, we'll get into the differences between those two. But yeah, like I said, there's a lot of research was done in the 70s around this, and it's kind of fallen by the wayside in the advent of, antidepressants and other pain medications that may or may not be highly addictive, but its effects are profound for me. I'm very profound. And I also have a really nasty burn, like a 2nd-degree burn on my thigh that I think I don't really feel unless somebody hits it. And again, I think it's because of the use of this DLPA.
Well, it's true. It's miraculous for physical pain as well as for emotional pain.
Okay, and then what about our inner sunshine? There's also one that kind of an amino acid that acts as our inner sunshine. What is that one? Tell us about that.
That one is the most important for our conversation about where have these amino acids been? Why don't more people know about them? That amino acid is called tryptophan. And it is the fuel for our natural antidepressant, serotonin. So it gives all the attributes of a depression-free person: optimism, absence of worry, absence of fears, absence of irritability, just that hopefulness and positive outlook. We call it inner sunshine.
Love it. And a lot of our antidepressants work on, tryptophan, serotonin, right? They're looking and modulating the impact of serotonin in the brain. And you can combine these. And I used to use tryptophan, and now I've realized I think I'm much more of a DLPA girl. Tryptophan made me a little irritable sometimes for whatever reason. I don't know.
You can get the reverse effect from any amino acid if you don't need it.
Right.
Which is nice, because then you don't continue taking something you don't need, because you get a signal, this isn't the right thing for me.
And you get it quickly, right? It's not like you're waiting around for weeks and weeks. It's within, what would you say when you're practicing? How quickly do you know?
Well, I can tell you, we didn't know initially because we just sent people home with bottles after identifying which ones would be the most helpful for them, we thought. But then about 5 years into it, we discovered that we could trial them on the spot. And people can go to my YouTube channel and see volunteers trialing the amino acids we just talked about. And so they can see for themselves that about 2 minutes is typically what it takes when you have the right dose, which is quite often the starting dose, whatever the starting dose might be for that particular supplement. But if you don't get a response, you can always take a second trialing dose, and then we start seeing the 2-minute transformation.
Yeah. And if you have a negative reaction, there's a way to kind of back that up or kind of get through that, right?
Yes, and the instant we send people trialing kits because my clinic is now virtual. So they have samples of everything. And among the samples is a nice little packet of vitamin C powder in capsules. They open the capsule of vitamin C with a little water and swish it around. And, again, within another minute or so, it's flushed the liver and you don't have any of the negative symptoms. I can't tell you how seldom we have to use that, by the way.
It's amazing, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, people are so deficient now because of our low protein diet. All of these amino acids are the constituents of protein.
And I gotta tell you, I grew up in a very happy family, and I did develop an eating disorder when I was young, and I can't decide, was I deficient in endorphins? And what you've learned from you is that it can raise those endorphins. But also, I was a young ballerina, and I was in this environment where they told me to smoke and eat lettuce and take ginseng. So it was multifactorial for sure. But one of the things that has stood out to me about your work is I had a loving mother and father. I had a great life. And it still seemed like I just really struggled. And so what really resonated with me was this true versus false mood. So can you talk about this distinction? I think it's so important for people who are like, I have everything and yet I don't feel good. What's up with that?
Well, I think it's nice that you started out with that, I don't feel good, and then, what we do is put flesh on it. What does that mean? And we give people a 40 symptom list of neurotransmitter deficiency symptoms that are emotional. The neurotransmitters can affect our appetite and our moods. So we've been able to identify through, decades now of research, what are the symptoms of someone, for example, who's been anorectic, who's been starving, and also burning the protein that contains these amino acids in exercise. So that it doesn't have a chance to replenish the brain sites that are starving, literally. What we found early on, because my outpatient program, I became the director of outpatient programs in the agency that I started as an intern in. And I wanted to provide counseling for eating disorders as well as addictions. And so we started getting lots of people with bulimia and anorexia. And the very nice research that was done at the time identified that both of those conditions reflected low levels of endorphin. So our natural painkiller. When we provided actually, with an anorectic, we had to provide all of the amino acids, but tryptophan and DLPA, the serotonin and the endorphin boosters, were just stellar. Again, immediately they started to relax and stop obsessing. With the anorectics, they're so deeply, deeply depleted that it would take us a couple of weeks before they could start eating more. But they were willing to take the supplements because there were no calories. And so it was a wonderful, life-saving intervention.
Yes. And I love that it's, when you aren't eating, you're not getting protein. Your protein is being broken down into these amino acids that are then precursors to our neurotransmitters, to the way that we feel. And today, when we're eating 60 to 70% of our foods from ultra-processed foods, and protein is getting more popular, right? We're starting to understand protein. But I think a lot of women are still pretty protein deficient. And so I love to say, if your life's going well and you're still not feeling good, that isn't necessarily all there is. you could be deficient in something to produce the chemicals that your brain needs to feel good. So it's hard to feel hopeless. And so I just love that this gave me such hope, and that I just want to share with people that it could just be, I think an imbalance in your brain has been way overutilized when it comes to like antidepressants, right? But I do think some of us are, like you said, high stress people. Maybe we were born with from a mother who didn't have a lot of endorphins, or our enzyme capacity, maybe we're breaking them down for whatever reason. I just think this is so important to say, like, there's true moods, when your friend gets into a car crash, your friend has a surgery, you have a loss. And then there's these false moods, these biological based moods, right? Would you say that's accurate?
Absolutely. People who don't know why they feel so bad, especially, they can feel lonely even though they're happily married. They're all negative moods that don't make sense, are really a great indicator. But you've left out one thing that I want to mention before we go any further, and that is that we're undergoing a tremendous dietary ordeal. And that is, ultra processed food, which has no food value other than carbohydrate, simple carbohydrate. In fact, it's, very toxic, but it's been designed to be addictive. And it's been very successful in doing that, so that people are living on a protein-free diet, so they're literally not getting the protein that they need to make themselves happier, let alone, build muscle, improve skin, all of the thousands of purposes that amino acids fill.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll get to your recommendations for protein intake in a second, in a little bit. But first, let's do a deep dive. DLPA. So I was cruising through life. I love my work. I love my family. Everything's great. But, I'm getting to an age where, people I love are ailing, right? I'm raising a child. Certain life events happen. And I found myself a few weeks ago just like in this place where joy was harder to come by. Let's just say that. And I reached out to Julia, and this was when I decided to trial the DLPA. And like I said, it in one weekend transformed my relationship to my husband, to my life, to just everything going on around me. And I finally felt like the person who had enough to give back to others. Before, I kind of felt like this vacuum. I had turned into this person who was just like sucking the joy out of a lot of different situations, because I didn't have that. I didn't have that baseline level, I think, of endorphins. So Julia, talk about how is that possible? What is DLPA? Break it down for us, and why does this happen? You've alluded to a little bit of the endorphin, but tell us, what are endorphins? How are they produced? Just give us the whole DLPA story.
Well, keeping in mind how critically important it is to have endorphins, that you've just described it beautifully, what an endorphin-less brain can produce in the way of joylessness. So many of our clients are in your category. Their life is going rather well, they have a good family, that, the good things are happening to them, but they still feel not only emotional pain, just day to day, and a lack of pleasure and a lack of joy, but they often describe feeling sad for no reason, lonely for no reason,
Tearing up. Do they tear up? Yeah.
Yes. So they're grieving, which is grief is a symptom of drained endorphins, but there's nothing to grieve about. So that's what we mean by false mood when it comes to endorphin deficiency. And so we were blessed that in the 1960s, several physicians, one was the head of pharmacology for Chicago Medical School, Dr. Aaron Priest, was critically concerned about the amount of morphine they were having to use to kill the pain of their post-surgery patients in the hospital. And so he began to investigate what they could give in addition to morphine to allow them to lower the dose. And he came across research about the endorphins and began to learn that we have this natural capacity to kill pain. And he discovered that there were some nutrients that would serve that purpose by slowing down the body's elimination of endorphins. So the body makes endorphins like a fountain, and then if it overflows, it's eliminated. So there's always a balance. But our balance can be thrown off, maybe genetically, by starvation. There are a lot of possible triggers. And what they found was that this particular amino acid, D-phenylalanine, or the combination of D and L-phenylalanine, was able to almost instantly restore that sense of well-being, reduce the amount of physical and emotional pain. So they call it an endorphinase inhibitor. Endorphinase is the enzyme that destroys endorphin. And so the DPA slows that down for people who are destroying too fast or who don't have any endorphin to begin with, to speak of. The L-phenylalanine in the DL that you can get these amino acids in two forms, the D by itself or the D combined with the L. Now, why would they combine the D and the L? Because the L-phenylalanine is a primary component of enkephalin, which is one of the primary types of endorphin or natural painkillers that the brain produces. And it's composed of just 5 amino acids, but several of them are L-phenylalanine. So that combination can be perfect for many people, and some people prefer the D-phenylalanine by itself. They're both available, although the DL-phenylalanine is much more readily available.
Yeah, I've noticed that because I love it gives me energy too. Like it gives me energy. I take it in the morning and it gives me that inner sunshine drive. But I've been looking for the DPA form to maybe take at night, but it has been hard to find. Where do people find it?
Well, they can find it on my website. They can find it on the website called Lidtke, Lidtke. They can find it in the collection of amino acids by a company called Montiff, Montiff.
Great.
So it is, it's a limited treasure. And with you and everyone else, I really like people to sample both types. And just for the reason that you just explained, you're wondering whether the energy that you get from DL-phenylalanine might not be so good at night when you're trying to get to sleep. So why is it energizing? That's because the L-phenylalanine in DLPA is also the base from which tyrosine is produced. And tyrosine is our energizing and focusing and physical action programming amino acid.
Yes, and tyrosine is in the dopamine pathway and the norepinephrine pathway. So you call it the catecholamines, the stimulating. So I just find that so fascinating that the two different types of phenylalanine feed different pathways. One prevents the breakdown and the other kind of creates this stimulatory effect. And I don't know if you want to say anything because I didn't, but there's also a chemical called PEA. Does it help with the brain chemical? I looked at Dr. Fox's book, and he wrote way a long time ago. This was like 1985. And he was saying that DLPA also help with this brain chemical, PEA, which is actually kind of linked to the feeling of euphoria. It's in chocolate. And that some people with depressive states just have low levels. Do you have anything you want to say about that?
Well, I'd just like to say that Dr. Fox's book is a compendium of many researchers looking into the endorphin production in the brain and how we can feed that nutritionally. We'd have to test to see how much the benefits have to do with PEA and how much they have to do simply with endorphin production. And that's a very elaborate thing that's not readily available. So we haven't done it. So it's a good question, but we don't have the answer. We just know the answer from experience with thousands of people that these particular supplements produce pain-relieving wonders by raising endorphins.
Yes. And this is her book, and she's got many books. The Craving Cure, The Mood Cure. Highly recommend it. And also this one talks a lot about chronic pain and the fact that, and they pitted and imipramine.
We're talking about chronic physical pain.
Chronic physical pain.
Right.
Yeah,
so I've mentioned that too, but we don't get nearly the number of people with chronic physical pain as we do people with chronic emotional pain, and people don't really recognize that that even exists.
Interesting.
So it's important for me that you and I make it clear that emotional pain is a common reality now.
It is a common reality, and it's so sad. That's why I thought this message is so incredibly important. And in your book, I want you to kind of elaborate, because you did talk about the food piece in the beginning. So the link between endorphins and certain foods that we're eating. So what foods might we be drawn to, and which foods might make these fake endorphins? Like, how would we identify food is playing a role here, maybe?
Well, let's start by talking about my books. So I want to distinguish between my two books. The first book was The Diet Cure, which was mostly concerned about eating problems, thyroid problems. The next book was The Mood Cure, which was strictly focused on negative moods and and I make that distinction in that book between false moods and true moods. It also has a chapter on insomnia and addiction. And there's an entire chapter on the endorphins. And, so people can refer to that to get some of this information. So the most recent book is The Craving Cure that you just so graciously shown us. And that one is about our current epidemic of toxic and nutrient void foods, addictive nutrient void foods. And so that's why that book is also divided into chapters depending on the neurotransmitter that is depleted, because in food addiction, we can be depleted in all of the neurotransmitters that provide all of our positive mood qualities and experiences. So with that in mind, I broke it down in terms of which foods trigger which neurotransmitters to light up briefly. Toxic drugs, and I consider, ultra-processed food toxic drugs, operate by overstimulating different neurotransmitters. So briefly, and then you get the withdrawal symptom, and then you want more highly processed food. So the foods that are reliably triggering an endorphin surge, you won't be surprised with chocolate being on the top.
I'm a chocolate fiend, too. Okay. My family makes fun of me, so this is just this makes so much sense.
So there are a couple of other foods, though. Of course, anything very sweet, even if there's no chocolate in it, will trigger some endorphin release release, but can also trigger at the same time release of other neurotransmitters, like our natural antidepressant. So that's why we give people a complete assessment tool where we can identify which deficiency symptoms do you have, how many aminos do you need. Maybe you need all four. But the other two foods that are so popular and so surprising to people when we explain that these two foods have been identified for decades and actually are their formal names have the word morphine in them. So one of them is gluten-containing grain. So the formal name is not gluten, it's gluteomorphin, because its effect on the endorphins is so well established so long ago. Now the other common food that we find people addicted to also has the word morphine in its formal title, and that's dairy products, cow dairy products. And the name for them is casomorphin. So casein is the name of the particular protein that's unique to dairy products. And we just took a woman who literally, she was eating nothing but various kinds of cheeses and smoothies with milk.
And Julia, where were you when I was like 8? Because all I would eat was bread and cheese. Bread and cheese. Bread and cheese. So it feels like I'm coming home. I'm realizing it's been endorphins all along. Like I would trade everybody any food they had for a second roll. Like, I would eat like 8 of them. That would be my lunch. And that was all I wanted. So do you see that? Do you work with a lot with kids? And do you see that people who want to eat the bread and cheese, if you give them endorphins?
Yes, their mothers will call us up and say, I know this isn't good for my child. Can you help us? And we're, very happy to say, yes, it's an overnight sensation.
That's so good. And I read in your book too that I couldn't remember if it was a type of endorphin specifically but M&Ms increase endorphins by like 150%, or a type of endorphin. I can't remember. But just so you know, if M&Ms again were a total favorite of mine. Yeah.
Well, here, what have we got? We've got chocolate.
Yes.
And we've got sugar.
Yeah. There you go.
So it's a double whammy. And we've got the taste sensation of the crunch as well as the softness. So it's a brilliant product for its purpose.
Yeah, I'm telling you, it's life-changing. I think I've needed it my whole life. I'm just so glad I found it in my 40s. Before we go to practical stuff, what's your favorite supplement? How we start taking it? People used to use amino acids before. Right? Before the rise of antidepressants.
Good point.
They did. And then you said to me in a conversation, hey, I'm feeling a little down. People used to say, I'll take some tryptophan because I know that's going to increase serotonin, my inner sunshine. What happened, Julia? How did they fall out of favor?
Let me start by saying that tryptophan was actually, the FDA called for a voluntary ban in the supplement industry on the production and distribution of tryptophan for 16 years.
Why?
Well, here's the story. The supplement industry literally fed off of the discoveries of neuroscience about the brain chemistry. So the first neuroscience said, the brain chemistry of neurotransmitter function is really simple. These fabulously powerful, mood-enhancing, appetite-regulating molecules are made out of very specific single amino acids for the most part. And at that point, the supplement industry knew that it was onto something, and began to produce it. Tryptophan became very, very popular, and not only among lay purchasers, but also among physicians and psychiatrists. So along come the SSRIs, the selective serotonin inhibitors. They can't make any money because everybody knows that tryptophan is the specific nutrient that converts into serotonin. And the doctors are specifically saying to their reps, we don't need this. We already have something that's perfectly safe, proven itself over many, many years. What else have you got in your kit today? So this was a disaster when the first SSRI Prozac came out. And that was in 1997. In 1999, a small Japanese company made a tremendously toxic batch and sent it to the United States. They later admitted in court in the United States that they knew that it was contaminated when they sent it. And it killed many people and made thousands of people ill. Some of them temporarily, some of them had the residual for life. So that was a very convenient reason to ban tryptophan. And it was only through the intervention of an amino acid expert that the powers that be were persuaded to make it a voluntary ban that could be rescinded at any point. And that's why in 2005, we got tryptophan back. But in 1997, a form of tryptophan that had been very popular in Europe for 20 years was allowed to be produced in the United States, called 5-HTP. So just like you could take DPA or DLPA to raise your endorphin levels, to raise your serotonin levels, you could take tryptophan or 5-HTP. So the pharmaceutical industry, I'm sure, was nervous about this development, and the same neuroscientist who helped us understand the importance of tyrosine for stimulant addiction, for cocaine addiction, found that a combination of amino acids stopped food craving. And he made a supplement. A pharmaceutical company called Schiff, one of the big giants, produced it. There was a national documentary made about it.
What was it called? What was the documentary called? Do you remember?
I don't remember. It was so long ago. We have a copy because they filmed part of it, a good part of it, at my clinic. The documentary filmmakers received 50,000 calls of people wanting to know where they could get it. And the next thing that happened was that there was a segment on 2020 raising the question of whether it was safe or whether it was going to do the terrible things that the bad batch of tryptophan had done. And they said, well, if tryptophan is banned, then this should be banned too. Whereas the nutrition industry was saying, yeah, but it's been safe for 20 years in Europe. We're using the same, material. They went to other extremes to discredit it. And so although it wasn't banned, it was certainly inhibited in terms of, its sales.
Yeah. Its reputation was tarnished.
Yeah. So people lost track of the natural sources of their neurotransmitter production and were swept away in all the advertising for Prozac and all the following 10 amino SSRIs that have been produced since then. At the moment, SSRIs are pretty heavily discredited. Partly because of the internet, people are sharing the horror stories, or at least, the attempts to withdraw, the limited benefits, the side effects. All of that is becoming clear to people. And we get more and more people all the time wanting our help in withdrawing. And using the nutrients, 5-HTP or tryptophan it's a breeze to withdraw someone from antidepressants. But so another thing that's important to know here is that the patents for antidepressants is running out, so that the profits are going to be slashed hugely very soon. And they knew this in advance. They always agreed to a certain length of time for patent protection. But when I was looking around trying to find out why was dopamine so prevalent? Why are people talking about dopamine when they talk about reward, pleasure, any of the positive emotions? Somehow dopamine comes up, and the other 3 neurotransmitters are never mentioned anymore. And I did some investigation and discovered that the pharmaceutical industry has been behind this because they are about to come out with a new set of what will be highly publicized antidepressants that are dopamine targeted.
Yeah. Interesting, isn't it? And I was a child on antidepressants, and I have to tell you, it was bad. My experience was bad, and my parents' efforts were sincere, right? They listened to, psychiatrists who told them, we just got to keep cycling through. We're going to find one. But my experience was, I couldn't even cry sometimes. Like, I didn't have emotions. I was not myself. Everything was muted. I couldn't keep my head off my desk. I was on Wellbutrin, Seroxat, and I've seen the documentaries. These meds are not always safe and very unsafe, unfortunately, for certain people, right? Can be hard,
especially children. They were never researched for.
I know. If you watch The Secrets of Seroxat, it's a documentary that I've watched, and it's a little bit scary, which is again why your work is so profound. And let's just get into the dosing. So if someone wants to take this, how do they begin? How do they get your kit? Or should they just jump into DLPA if what we've talked about has resonated with them? Let's start there.
Well, let's start with educating themselves so that they can decide what their next step's going to be. So they could get the mood cure if mood is the primary problem, or they could get the craving cure if food cravings are the problem. And they can also get an e-publication called the Amino Aid Handbook on my website, juliarosscures.com. They can also order an amino trialing kit, which comes with a lot of information about how to trial, what to watch for, who shouldn't take which amino acids. There are, certain conditions that are contraindicated for certain amino acids. We've never seen anyone who couldn't take any, but sometimes there's one or another. For example, if someone it tends to be over-anxious, we wouldn't want that person to take a stimulating amino acid. But there are things like that actually they rule themselves out. Because once you start experimenting with dose, you find out within 2 minutes with each dose that you trial how it's affecting you. If it's positive, great. Then the question is, how positive? We're not looking for improvement. We're looking for elimination of the false moods. Total elimination of the false moods. That's what our goal is. And that's what we've been reaching in our clinic for decades. And there's no reason that it's not possible for people to do it on their own with these tools. So once they see which amino acids they're potentially, deficient in, and they trial them, then they can start dosing. And the supplement industry has been very good in establishing a basic dose for most amino acids for adults. But for children, you want to give a very small, open a capsule, use a very small amount. If there's no response in a few minutes, then you can add another little small amount. But for adults, Most of the amino acids are available in 500 milligram capsules. Tryptophan, tyrosine, your DLPA, DPA. Now, the one exception is GABA. GABA is available and very effective at much lower doses. So we typically start people at 125 milligrams, and they either use a chewable. GABA chewables are all over availability wise, or they open a 500 milligram capsule and take a quarter of it.
Yeah, and I'll just tell everyone, okay, not medical advice, and you can tell us if it's contraindicated with, well, actually, before I tell everyone what I've done, is it contraindicated if you're on certain antidepressants? Do we need to work with somebody or get their permission?
Well, yes, with any medication, you want to rule that out.
Yes, okay.
And
Perfect.
that's part of the reason that there are contraindications listed in all of my books, and the enclosure with the trialing kit has a list of contraindications to help people identify if there is any that might be a problem.
Perfect. And so what I started to do is I used the DLPA 500 milligrams in the morning. I'm not on any medications or anything like that. And then the other one that's been helpful for me is GABA. People who need a good drink of wine. So I'll do some GABA at night. Now, the other thing I want to say, my son, he coming from a probably endorphin depleted mother, I tested it with him. I opened up the capsule. And again, not saying this is what you should do. Check with your doctor, especially if your child's on medication. But I poured about half of it out. So it's probably 250 milligrams. And I gave it to him one day when we were on vacation. I've never seen him laugh and talk so much. He was a different child. And I asked my husband, I was like, are you noticing anything? He's like, oh my gosh, it's like, it's night and day. Like he's happy, he's laughing, he was just excited. And
So this is a quarter of the GABA?
No, this was DLPA too. I took a half. I gave him a half. Yeah.
That really helps confirm that there's a hereditary, genetic component to the deficiency.
Yeah, and we've also, as a family, and I think this is another thing we haven't really touched on, but when you have prolonged periods of stress, you get endorphin depleted, right? And I think that we're in one of those seasons. And so even if he's not working with a genetic deficiency, which I think he is, these long periods of stress. So is it safe for kids? Or what time period? How long do we want to use these things?
Before we go into that, you've just introduced two sets of false moods. You've talked about the sadness and the negativity and the absence of joy, but you also have mentioned 4 or 5 times just in the last 2 minutes the word stress. And so it's important to know that it's not a one-size-fits-all. And whenever stress is an issue, then you want to go for the possibility that there's a GABA deficiency, a deficiency in our natural tranquilizer, GABA.
Nice.
And you get with, a much smaller dose, you get an immediate sense of relaxation. So in the case of anyone who has both sets of symptoms, they need to consider taking both at least for a while.
And how long how safe are they? And how long can we take them? And is it different in children?
Children are a completely different world.
Yeah.
Low doses, short periods of time. The younger they are, the lower the dose. So we're talking about, just wetting the tip of your finger, dipping it in the capsule, and trialing it out with a really young child. With older children,
what do you consider
4 or 5? They can typically do like a quarter of a capsule. So it's a matter of trialing and then monitoring. So initially, while we're in a state of deep depletion, each dose lasts maybe 4 hours, the most, 3 or 4 hours. And so they may need to be taken between meals later in the day as well.
Yeah. What about 10 preteens and teens? Would you say like a half of a capsule?
Um, Preteens, definitely half of a capsule or less, depending. And I think most parents know when their children are sensitives.
Yes.
Oh, she's so sensitive to everything. Well, pay attention to that because you want to do low doses for a sensitive person and build up as needed rather than giving them a high dose and wishing you hadn't, waiting for the vitamin C to detox them. So with a teenager, though, quite often they need adult doses. So you start them at half doses, and then, but you're not surprised when that doesn't do as much for them as you had hoped. And at that point, you give them the other half of the capsule when you're trialing.
Yeah. I love that. And for in this book, if you're doing chronic pain, he did like a week on and like 3 weeks off once people kind of got that like level of release or relief. And what I've noticed is I did a week straight and then I was able to do intermittent days every so often. And with our son, it was like once a week or something like he's very sensitive and the effects seem to last. And so, and for me, I'm going to use it on times like unrelenting stress periods or, periods of loss. I might bring it back in periods of right now.
No. Stress, when you use the word stress, you want to bring in the GABA.
Okay. Bring in the GABA.
If you're talking about a return of unrelenting pain, definitely the DPA or DLPA.
Okay, great. And for me,
or
right
both.
now, yeah, and see that what I think my secret sauce is, and I hope that through this series, because we're gonna do a series with you, we're gonna go over all these. People find their secret sauce. Like I think mine's DLPA in the morning, and it's gonna be GABA at night, because I used to love that good glass of wine. So I think that's gonna be where I live, and I'm excited to teach people. But also, like I have a bad burn. And so DLPA, and I'm unable to exercise. Now, I'm someone who has relied on exercise for my mood my whole life. And so
that's something we didn't talk about.
Yeah,
that you brought up earlier. Let's talk about that just for a minute because it's a really great clue as to what's missing, in your mood chemistry. So if you find that the only time you reliably feel good is after a workout, after a long run, whatever, and those people know themselves. You're someone who's endorphin deficient. And building up your endorphins will mean that you don't over-exercise, that you don't, literally wear yourself out. We've had a lot of clients come in with workout-related injuries because they were trying to get to that point where they felt that rush. And it took too much out of them to do that on a regular basis.
Absolutely. It's been hard for me as I get into my 40s to just come from over an hour a day, which I used to do, to 45 minutes. I've realized I have to wean myself off of this. But now that I have an injury and I haven't been able to exercise in a whole week, and I was bracing myself and my family for the mood impact. But it's actually been quite manageable. And I was like, what do you think? To my husband, he's like, pretty impressive. And I was like, I think it's because of this. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that. Now, so DLPA, awesome. Get the first aid, the Amino aid handbook. I read it. It's great. And it's very I highly recommend that. And the trial thing. We'll teach about the other aminos and, a trialing kit would be great. Now, last thing I want to talk about is how do we build a diet that is supportive of not only endorphin production, but of just all the aminos that we need? Like how much protein, if we're a child, if we're a teen, if we're an adult, if we're a woman, what are your protein recommendations?
Well, let's start with an analysis of what each one of us is consuming in the way of protein, and because we're addicted to carbohydrates and damaged fats, we tend not to have an appetite for protein. And it's ironic because protein is the one food that can turn off our appetite for carbs and damaged fats. So what the first advice that I give people, I got a call from a physician in Turkey, and he was calling me because in Turkey they now have reached epidemic numbers of obesity cases, in young people, only in young people, because, middle age and older are still eating the traditional Turkish diet, which is very well balanced in terms of, whole carbs, whole fats, whole protein. And so he wanted me to help his niece, who was 300 pounds, and she was 16 years old. And so we met by Zoom, and the supplements weren't available, and they weren't sure how long it was going to take to get them there. So I said, in the meantime, do something that we always recommend, and that is to have a substantial serving of animal protein at least 3 times a day. And before you go for the foods that you know are causing the overweight, don't eat it until you've already had protein. So if you want to have a pastry, fine, but you have to have 2 or 3 eggs. You have to have the equivalent of a hamburger patty, a couple of lamb chops, a good piece of fish beforehand. And she laughed, but she did it. And her food consumption was cut in half immediately that first week.
Wow.
So what is it about protein? All it is amino acids, really. And so we're getting at least, the bottom line of the entire complete array of amino acids. That's 20 amino acids. We have to have access to, and they're all available in high protein foods. But so getting back to the American diet, things started to change in the 70s when the tobacco industry bought up the snack food industry and began to use the techniques that they knew could addict people to foods. And part of this transformation from a healthy, traditional food-loving population in the United States to, chronically ill, ultra-processed food addicts had to do with the discovery and utilization of high fructose corn syrup. So the other thing was that in the 70s, we became heavily influenced by Eastern religion. And vegetarian or vegan diets were promoted as the, equivalent of piety, of spiritual intelligence, and so we began to adopt it without any kind of consideration of what its impact would be. So then as we shifted that towards a higher higher carbohydrate, higher fat diet and away from animal protein, we began to gain weight. And so then we went on low calorie diets, which starved us, literally. We became, a nation of temporary anorectics. And the results, suppressed thyroid, inability to lose weight, continued, and our addictive appetite for these endorphin, temporarily thrilling foods. So, we have to, in order to overcome the cravings for junk foods, and to find out what we really need, what our body really needs, rather than what a spiritual discipline says everyone needs, that requires an open mind and experimentation.
Yeah, Julie, I don't even know if you know, but I did a whole docuseries called Rethink Meat about this, and we went into the origins of our food and tried to dismantle them because, like you, I believe our deficiency of animal-based nutrients, including the highly bioavailable protein, has not only made us tired and, like you said, deficient, but is starving our brains. Because I've done all the things, right? Psychiatric medications, I've done therapy, I truly, and I say this so sincerely, I think your work and amino acids and fixing my false moods has been the most impactful of all of the interventions. And I know people can start, there's many different entry points and everybody's different, but I really notice the most profound improvement when I'm listening to your work. So one last question, and then you can tell us where to connect with you, is just, are there other supplements? And the other thing I didn't mention is you've helped a company to create a full amino acid complex. And when you're taking individual aminos, it's different than eating foods and different than taking a full amino because of the competition, right? So this is going to bypass the competition. You're going to have a much better absorption than if you're taking all the other aminos. But given that, my history of stress, and I want to replete my stores too, I do sometimes take that full amino acid supplement at night too. So, are there other supplements? That's what I was
I
getting.
wouldn't take it at night because it includes both relaxing and stimulating amino acids.
When would you take it? Like noon?
Anytime, morning, noon, mid-afternoon, but not any later than that. The company that hired me to consult with them, along with my nutritionist at the time, is called Total Amino Solutions. And it's a free form product, meaning the aminos are immediately bioavailable. That's not true for example, whey protein. Those amino acids are bound together, so it takes more work to free them for use. So we found out how extraordinarily beneficial this particular product was when we started to get a lot of referrals from acupuncturists who specialized in infertility, because they would do the work. They helped women to get into a position where they actually could have children. So while they were pregnant, they weren't sure how to get them to eat healthful food because, these people had cravings for junk foods. They had negative moods, things that acupuncture just wasn't able to help with. And so one of them called me, a local acupuncturist, and I told her, send somebody over and we won't give them full strength individual amino acids, which are not recommended for pregnant women. So we gave this woman and all the subsequent women that were sent to us this particular amino acid. And while they didn't get rid of 100% of their negative moods, because the amounts of each amino acids were small, there were 20 in all, or more, in each capsule, they got rid of enough that they could eat healthful food and have successful pregnancies.
Beautiful. Another brilliant application that we hadn't touched on. And are there other supplements? I'm a big advocate of fish oil for mood and just better brain function. I also take magnesium. Is there anything else in your arsenal that you see time and time again is also helpful?
The other thing that we require is a multi that is quite robust, and particularly has lots of magnesium and chromium, which is deficient in all diabetics and pre-diabetics, and most of us now, because sugar depletes it. Sugar consumption depletes chromium levels, and replenishing it helps to stop the cravings and restore blood sugar normalcy, in health. So there's one product in particular that we recommend.
Great.
It's called Glucobalance.
Okay.
Now, for someone who's diabetic or pre-diabetic, they have to typically they're terribly nutrient deficient. That's something no one ever talks about in terms of this epidemic that we're going through. It's well known to be glutamine deficient, chromium deficient, across the board deficient, deep deficiencies. So they need to take, I think it's 4 a day, but people who are not at that point can do 2 a day and still get an incredible array of nutrients in good forms. So in terms of the omegas, I prefer to have them do a fatty acid panel And those are readily available. People can order them themselves from Nordic Naturals, from Omega Quant. And of course, if they're seeing a naturopath or a physician that's open to it, they can easily get a lab test for fatty acid levels.
Do you have an omega index percentage that you like to see people over? Like if you get the Omega Quant, I'm imagining it's an omega-3 index test. Is that what you're using?
Yes.
What index? Over?
But we're frankly, a lot of it has to do with, we just tell people have, high omega-3 fish, wild salmon and sardines and whatever, twice a week or more, whatever, is you can tolerate. And if that and the amino acids and the multivitamin don't work, then we get more serious about assessing for fatty acid deficiency. Of course, if there's, a TBI, something where the brain has actually been injured, then that's another matter. And that's really the therapeutic use of fatty acids.
Perfect. Yeah, what I do is I have fish probably 3 to 4 times, herring, salmon, and sardines. And it's very simple. I've talked about it a lot. But yeah, my omega index, I tested the other day. It's at a 9.5. So I'm like, okay, I'm in a good place with the fatty acids. I've learned a lot about those. But like I said, DLPA, thank you, Julia. This has been game changer for me. And like I said, I'll bring in GABA and DLPA if I have unrelenting stress in my life or if I'm just feeling depleted or tearing up over everything. I'm also thinking about when I do like a dental procedure, I might do it a few days before that or something else that might be potentially painful. And, I just wanted to say thank you because your work. So let us know if there's any other times you think this would be appropriate. And then also tell us where we can connect with you. And also, if you're watching, when you're watching, you are watching, tell us in the comments, which amino acid do you want to learn more about next? Is it tryptophan? Is it your inner sunshine?
Great idea.
Is it the alcohol? Is it the brake pedal, the kind of calming, or the GLP-1, the one that stimulates GLP-1 and actually can curb sugar cravings? Or is it more about tyrosine and dopamine and focus? And let us know in the comments below. And then, yeah, Julia, tell us, what did we miss? Where can we connect with you? And are there any other uses you don't think we've covered for this?
We don't use DLPA for anything except what we've discussed. So I can't really address anything else, other than emotional and, secondarily physical pain. We rarely see someone who's in chronic physical pain, but, we did have someone come in, he was a colleague and he just wanted to talk about, integrating amino acid therapy into his practice, his addiction practice. And, but I saw that he couldn't really straighten one of his legs and seemed to be in chronic pain. And, I asked him whether he'd ever used any aminos himself, and he said no. And so I had him fill out the questionnaire, the questionnaire is on the website, so people can go right to it.
Link to that.
And so we did, it just took a minute or two, and it was clear that he was an endorphin deficient person. So I asked him if he would like to take some DLPA or some DPA, and he was open to it. And so then we went on talking. He took a capsule of DLPA, and about 4 or 5 minutes into the conversation, I asked him whether he was feeling any different in terms of that chronic pain. He'd been a rodeo star and had many injuries, and so it was long-standing. He'd been living with that pain. So he said, well, I'm sitting down. I don't really notice it until I try to walk. He got up and he walked away from me. He turned around with a big smile and said, I'm not in pain. So that's an example of, that's the first thing to try if, physical pain is a problem, but we aren't experts in that because we just haven't seen that many people in severe physical pain. But we know that this product was developed by doctors whose primary concern was physical pain. And there's plenty of research. Again, it hasn't been duplicated or honored, really. because it doesn't bring profits. You know, the supplement industry doesn't get the kind of profit that the pharmaceutical industry gets.
Yeah. And clinical trials are very expensive. And like you said, we have big pharmaceutical companies who have a lot invested in these, billion-dollar drugs. And these little aminos, you get it for like a few pennies on the dollar. Like, who's studying? Nobody's gonna fork over the millions of dollars it required, or very few people, to do the clinical trials. But her book, and your work with addicts, and his book and his work with pain. And I think he was the president of the American College of Pain Management or something like that, Arnold Fox. So this is very well established. Julia's been doing it for 40 years. So thank you, Julia. Like, again, from the bottom of my heart.
You're welcome.
Let me know if there's anything that we missed. I will put all the links. I'll put the Amino handbook down there, your trialing kit, and of course, your website. Let us know if there's any famous last words from you.
I've been directing clinics, since early 1980s. And during COVID, we had to convert to virtual clinic, which actually we love because we can get people the trialing kits, then set up a trialing session where we watch them. And so anyone who doesn't want to try it by themselves, or does try it and feels confused. One thing we didn't talk about, which we can talk about in the future, but how long do you need to take them? This is a temporary fix. Like, you're already finding out you can go days without. So everybody is different. And the people that we've seen that have needed it for about a year were people with a heavy genetic tendency towards alcoholism.
Ah.
So there's, certain people have a more difficult time normalizing their neurotransmitter function, but it happens. And when we did the documentary, there were a number of people, former clients there, who weren't using them anymore at all. But they'd had to use them for like 8 to 12 months in diminishing amounts.
Wow. Isn't that crazy? And in our family, there was alcoholism. So it makes sense that I just come from a line of endorphin depleted, lovely humans. And so I'm excited that, I found you and your work. So everybody, let us know in the comments. Are you going to try it? What else? What other amino do you want to hear about next? And again, Julia, truly life-changing information you're sharing. And I'm deeply, deeply grateful for your work and just for your exuberance and your just perseverance and your honesty. So thank you, Julia. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you too.